Thank you to everybody for joining us this evening here in Boston time, and I know morning in the Philippines. And most of our speakers today are actually logging in from the Philippines, so appreciate them getting up in the morning to do this. My name is James Robson. I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center, and it's a real pleasure to have everyone here this evening for the third talk in our series in the new Philippines lecture series. Last week, in fact, we had a talk by Marites Vitug from the Philippines on the South China Sea issues. And this evening, the main topic that we'll be discussing is the impacts of COVID-19 on marginalized communities in the Philippines. And I'd like to first extend a word of thanks to our friend Enzo Bollettino for his help in bringing this panel together. It's really his expertise and contacts that have made this possible, and it's a wonderful topic to cover. And so thank you very much, Enzo. So I'll begin. The structure for this evening is going to be there'll be three presentations divided up among some speakers and that I'll be introducing, and each of them will present for about 15 minutes. And then we'll have some time for dialogue among the participants and also with the audience for questions. You can, since we're doing this in a meeting format, you can either use the chat box to type in a question, or you can also use the reactions tab on Zoom and just raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can ask your question orally. Okay, so let me begin first with introductions here. And the first speaker will actually be Enzo Bollettino himself, who is the director of the Resilient Communities program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And he also leads the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative's engagement in the National NGO program on humanitarian leadership. Before taking on this position, he served as the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative executive director for 5 years. His research focuses on civil-military engagement during humanitarian emergencies, disaster preparedness, and resilience, and also the professionalization of the humanitarian aid field and humanitarian leadership. And the topic he'll be presenting on is pandemics, disasters, and preparedness in the Philippines. The second presentation will be by Ara Jo Pacoma. I'm speaking on behalf of also Yvonne Su and Ginbert Permejo Cuaton. And so Ara is an instructor at the Leyte Normal University in Tacloban City, Philippines. She holds an MA in political science from the University of San Jose Recoletos, and her research interest includes post-disaster social capital and resilience. And she obtained her BA in social sciences in political science at the University of the Philippines, Visayas Tacloban College. And Yvonne Su, who is part of that team, is an assistant professor in the Department of Equity Studies at York University in Toronto. And she holds a PhD in political science and international development from the University of Guelph and a master in refugee and forced migration studies from the University of Oxford. Her research expertise is in post-disaster recovery, forced displacement, and resilience. And the third member of that team is Ginbert Permejo Cuaton, and is a PhD student at the Division of Environment and Sustainability of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. His research interests include translations of resilience from extreme weather events to contemporary crises, post-disaster community development, and resilience and adaptation strategies. And then we're hoping right now, we're waiting for the third speaker or third topic speaker to join us, but we'll put her last. And this is Eden Terol, who is a registered psychologist and assistant professor of applied psychology at the University of Philippines Diliman Extension Program in Pampanga. And she formerly served as a psychologist at the National Center for Mental Health and has worked with Indigenous peoples communities. And the topic of her presentation will be a clinician's reflections on post-disaster trauma care, intervention for Indigenous communities in the time of COVID. So thank you to everybody. It's a nice, wonderful turnout of speakers. And I will turn the microphone over to Enzo for his presentation on pandemics, disaster, and preparedness in the Philippines. So take it away, Enzo. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. It's truly a pleasure to be here this evening, and I'd like to say personal thanks to the Asia Center for really focusing in on South Asia, Southeast Asia, and some of the issues that affect that region of the world. I've also appreciated over the years the support that you've provided to researchers like myself and many others. I'd just like to say a word to everyone who's joined us this evening or this morning for you in the Philippines and in Asia, and to call attention to the events that the Asia Center sponsors, organizes, and holds. They're really fantastic. They bring a really multidisciplinary approach to the work they do. They cover a very wide variety of topics, and I think there's really something in it for everyone who's interested in Asia, so I encourage you to follow them. I'm Enzo Bollettino, formerly Vincenzo Bollettino, but I go by Enzo. I work with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, as James mentioned, and I've been working for the past 7 years now doing research on disaster preparedness, resilience, and response in the Philippines, largely some in Bangladesh as well. I'm going to speak this evening about some of the findings from the research that we did on disaster response, but only in as much as it pertains to lessons that are relevant for the pandemic and for COVID-19's impact on the Philippines. I'll say before I get started that we, as with many organizations globally and of course in the region as well, we're focused on a number of other issues at the time that the pandemic impacted, and we were deep in research on disaster preparedness when we realized that we weren't going to be able to do the on-the-ground research that we were doing. We wouldn't have the access, and we also felt an obligation to do something to respond to the pandemic as well. And so really pivoted our research to look at the impacts of COVID-19 and how we could utilize our academic resources and research skills to be able to address some of those things. So those are the two issues that I'm going to touch on here. So as relates to some of the findings from a large nationwide survey that we did in the Philippines in 2017, looking at how households across the country prepare for disasters and what their experiences are with disasters, I wanted to highlight a couple of findings that I think are quite relevant for the experience with COVID as well. So one of the things that we found when asking what people felt was the role, whose role it was to actually respond to disasters when a disaster happened, the vast majority of people, more than 2/3, felt that it was local government units within the Philippines that had that responsibility. They also saw their own families and the national government as having a role, but really that local government unit was the one primarily responsible, with far less expectation that charitable communities, community-based organizations, or other non-governmental organizations actually had that responsibility to respond. The same holds true, the same trend holds true in terms of who should be responsible for actually preparing for disasters. Again, many felt that families had an individual responsibility, but that really a lot of the responsibility lay with the local government. When it comes to what they actually saw happen when they experienced a disaster, the vast majority said that it was actually the immediate family members and those in the neighborhood that were providing immediate assistance. There was assistance from national government and local government, but you can see that both of those things switched. So whereas nearly 70% expected that the government had a responsibility, half that number actually experienced that. And whereas around 30% felt it was the family's responsibility, twice that number actually received aid from their own families. But what's really quite interesting here as well is that nearly 5 times as many people said that civil society was playing a really large role in the response. And that's going to come to play a part in pandemic response and preparedness as well. Another second point that I'd like to make. So the first point is really that people's expectations and their actual experience diverge. Okay, they're not always well aligned. The second point I want to make is that everything is context-based, particularly in a place like the Philippines, which is an archipelago made up of thousands of islands, more than 2,000 of which are inhabited, and nearly close to 7,000 islands in all. So this is a country that it's difficult to traverse, and that had both benefits and drawbacks in the pandemic. But the second point that I wanted to make from the disaster piece is that resources are not equally shared or equally accessible across different regions. And so the context really matters for how people both experience and are able to access resources to prepare for and respond to disasters. That same thing holds true for the pandemics as well. So if we take a look here, we looked at how people prepare for disasters across 3 dimensions: training, planning, and material investments, with the national average appearing right in the center of the columns. But then you look at the sort of extremes where you had the greatest percentage involved in training in the national capital region on the top right. But then within the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, you have only 3% of people actually involved in training for disasters. So again, the point here is that how disasters are experienced, prepared for, responded to, is really context dependent. And it's hard to think about it at a national level when it's really experienced quite locally. And this says a lot also for national policies, because not all national policies will be as relevant or as effective at a local level than as compared to others. So I mentioned that we transitioned from looking at our sort of normal focus on disasters to how COVID was impacting the Philippines. Initially, we had decided to do this by working with organizations on the ground to provide training, and quickly realized that we're not going to be able to reach that many people, and that connectivity issues were really going to limit who we could reach out to. So one of the things we decided, amongst others, to do instead was to just contact Filipino researchers who are already looking at the impacts of COVID on marginalized communities in a variety of different ways. And as we know, with it, in the same way that this is true for disasters and other sort of social phenomenon, it's marginalized communities that really disproportionately get impacted and feel the effects of disasters, and also have the fewest, the least access to resources to be able to quickly emerge and recover from them. The same holds true with the pandemic. So what we did was we did a call for papers across the Philippines. We had a team here at Harvard that was able to review those submissions. We received 60 papers. We evaluated those, selected 9, and we held a symposium where those 9 papers were presented. I'm going to summarize some of those findings here, and then a group of colleagues who participated in that symposium will be presenting their specific research in detail following my presentation. Now, what are marginalized groups? We're quite broad in the way this was defined, and we really let it emerge organically from how researchers in the Philippines responded to the request for papers on marginalized communities. So marginalized communities included people like seafarers who were often trapped out at sea during the pandemic and had few access to resources, or sometimes were trapped on land and then couldn't get back to their own provinces. Household domestic workers, garment industry workers, the homeless, Indigenous groups, the elderly, the poor, and the displaced. So we looked at a variety of different kinds of marginalized groups across the Philippines. So what were some of the impacts that we saw that really emerged from this conversation in the symposium? One was during the initial outbreak of the pandemic, there was a lot of confusion over who was actually considered an essential worker. So it wasn't really clear at the start about who was expected to show up at work and who wasn't. There were also a finding that there was really insufficient social and economic measures in place already as part of national policy to really be able to protect people, particularly in larger industries, where there was no option for them not to work and where social distancing was made difficult just because of the nature of the work. The Philippines is one of the places that had one of the longest, if not the longest, hard lockdown in the world. And this led to many people being stranded across the country. There was a perception in the Philippines, as there was in many countries, that there was really a two-tier system when applying sort of the rules. One that was for the elite, which was able to get away with convening and skirting the rules without great punishment, and then another sort of experience for everybody else. And then finally, there were really significant mental health impacts, and hopefully we'll be able to get into that in a little bit more detail in just a bit. So let me turn to some of the coping strategies that emerged. So looking at coordination and communication, those areas where there was really a lot of connectivity, already strong connectivity between academia, local government, other civil society organizations, it was much easier to gain access and to provide services. So one of the things that came up is that while the government was trying to formulate policy, civil society organizations were already able to come in providing goods, services, information, awareness raising before the government really ramped up its response. Another finding was that using and implementing feedback mechanisms was really vital for understanding the very specific community needs in different areas. Remembering again that context really matters, because you're talking about people who have different ethnic, religious backgrounds, speak even different languages. So not everyone across the Philippines can be expected to have the same set of needs or desires when it came to COVID. And so understanding that local context really made a big difference. Another thing that came up was that in areas where there was a lot of collaboration with academia, there was a real notice that the provision of empirical evidence was really important for diminishing the effects of misinformation. And it was also really valuable for civil society organizations to be able to do impactful information drives to raise awareness on how to deal with COVID. Local leadership. Local leadership was absolutely instrumental in being able to access communities. Where there was strong local leadership and there was an ability to access those local leaders, access was far easier, communication was far easier, and the overall response was much better. Many organizations that were working on different issues, particularly around peace and security and humanitarian response, also transitioned quickly to COVID-19 response, and that really made a big difference as well. The ability of actors to be flexible in terms of their programming, to be able to switch to meet the needs of the pandemic. Adaptation and resilience. One of the interesting things that came out of this was the sort of adaptability of people to really transition, move, and adapt to the lockdown by focusing on other cottage industries, for example, particularly around pottery, but also around small shops. People would begin to sell food utilizing their own small shops. And this was really quite useful because people wanted to avoid large crowded marketplaces. And so suddenly people could open smaller shops, and that provided, at least in some instances, some relief for the economic impacts of the pandemic. It's not clear that it really completely negated the huge impact that the pandemic had economically on displacement of workers, but it did have a kind of mitigating effect. Local organizations were able to undertake food drives as well and set up food pantries, and they were able to access marginalized communities and groups in ways that other national organizations, and especially international organizations, could not. Finally, thinking about future considerations, technology can play a big role and did here in the Philippines. Many people started to sell their wares and goods online when they had never done so before, as a way of adapting to the situation. Mental health needs were really significant, and the fact that there were many organizations and networks that were providing free mental health care services turned out to be really a pivotal piece of providing support to an otherwise isolated population. Again, all of this is experienced very locally, and context is important. And this is really vital for thinking about not only future pandemics, but for future disasters as well, and how we organize and prepare for those. sensitivity to local tradition, culture, and medicine is tremendously important. Again, speaking to the need to really understand the context before intervening. So looking for ways to support local leadership that really understands that local context is something that emerged as a really strong lesson learned. And I'm definitely way out of time here, so I'll stop with that. Look forward to any questions you might have in the Q&A, and we'll turn it over now to my other colleagues from the Philippines. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Enzo. That was really super interesting, kind of big level look at what the response was like. So very, very interesting. So thank you very much. And we'll now turn to Ara, who will be presenting on behalf of their research team. And the overall title of this presentation is Forgotten Survivors, Impacts of COVID-19 on Haiyan Survivors in Resettlement Sites in Tacloban City, Philippines. So Ara, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, thank you, James. Okay, so hi everyone. I'll be presenting the results of our study in the resettlement sites in Tacloban City, Philippines. So as have Enzo mentioned earlier, Philippines actually implemented one of the world's strictest and longest lockdowns in response to COVID-19. So local governments across the country has also implemented community quarantines in the face of the rising threats of the COVID-19 virus. Tacloban City, for instance, has enforced restrictions to mitigate the spread of the COVID-19 in the city. But while still recovering from the physical, economic, and social destruction caused by Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, the tens of thousands of people relocated to resettlement sites on the outskirts of the city are also facing the impacts of COVID-19 to their lives and livelihoods. Thus, we asked, how does the COVID-19 pandemic impact the daily survival and livelihoods of disaster-affected households living in resettlement areas in Tacloban City? So we conducted our fieldwork in the resettlement sites in Tacloban North, namely in SM Cares Village, in North Hill Arbors, in Tacloban North Village, and in Ginbert. So we chose these 4 resettlement sites based on population ranging from very large to small in order to capture the experiences in a diversity of resettlement types. So a survey was conducted in the local language of Waray in order to address the key question of the study. We completed a total of 352 surveys during our fieldwork in June 2021. But due to COVID-19, fieldwork was hard to complete, and so we aimed to achieve 5 to 15% of the households in each resettlement site. 10% of the household was interviewed in both Jimville and Tacloban North villages, while 5% in North Hill Arbors because it is significantly bigger, and 15% in SM Cares Village because it is much smaller compared to the others. So drawing on data from the 352 surveys, we found the following key lessons. First, pre-existing issues of a lack of livelihood were exacerbated during the pandemic and led to increased food insecurity. Even before the pandemic, the survivors living in the resettlement sites were already facing issues on the lack of livelihood and water supply and transportation services in the resettlement sites, hindering their post-disaster recovery. And during the pandemic, the respondents believe that its most significant impacts range from them earning less and losing jobs. For example, micro businesses and construction companies closed, and many daily wage laborers were also laid off due to bankruptcy. Because of these impacts, several of our respondents believe that the amount and quality of household food decreased, so forcing them to reduce their meals from 3 to 2 to cope, thereby increasing food insecurity among the resettlement site households. Secondly, as traditional coping mechanisms and support networks failed, households turned to negative coping strategies like high interest debt. While borrowing money and incurring debt has been a way of life in the resettlement site, the pandemic has made it more difficult to escape the debt trap as income dwindle or disappear and as food and transportation costs inflate. So several of our respondents loaned money from Indian nationals through the 5-6 arrangement. This is a lending scheme that maintains 20% monthly interest rate from the borrowed capital. This type of high interest debt is a negative coping strategy which residents feel forced to undertake to survive. Finally, a lack of government public health campaigns has created an opportunity for rampant social media fake news about COVID-19 and the effectiveness of the vaccines. So 95.80% of the respondents were still unvaccinated at the time of the data gathering because of concerns about the vaccine's possible side effects and its future unknown effects, or due to a lack of trust in the COVID-19 vaccines, as most of our respondents also claim that they have come across fake news about COVID-19 as well as on the COVID-19 vaccines and social media, particularly Facebook. So our current findings actually highlight the need to rethink how post-disaster relief, reconstruction, and longer-term responses ought to be done to co-produce programs and outcomes that co-benefit disaster survivors. The lack of inclusive and participatory community consultations with sweeping emphasis on techno-managerial and infrastructure responses disregard actually the political capabilities, sociocultural sensitivity, and longer-term implications to people who are most affected by the resettlement process. This was seen in how the current pandemic has exacerbated the household's livelihood and food insecurity. So that's it for our presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ara. That was really interesting, and I have a number of questions I hope once we get to the Q&A, I'd love to be able to ask you and your team about. So right now, our third presenter, Eden Terol, has some connectivity issues in the Philippines, I've learned. And so we are going to have Mark Toldo, who is in the Philippines and is one of Enzo's team members there, who will be playing a pre-recorded presentation from Eden. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you very much for your help to make this happen on a very short notice.
Hello, good day everyone. This is Eden Terol. In times of calamities, rescue and relief operations are conducted to ensure safety to the survivors of disaster and address issues that resulted from the calamity. Psychosocial support workers help the survivors deal with loss, disorientation, and trauma as a result of the disaster. However, getting access to psychosocial support is particularly challenging for remote communities that are difficult to reach by social services, such as many Indigenous communities. The time of the pandemic, during which lockdown or community quarantine was implemented, made it more challenging to access outside support for calamity-stricken communities. This study explored the challenges experienced by 2 Filipino Indigenous groups in the aftermath of disaster and the resources or sources of strengths available that may be utilized for intervention. One group explored was the Aitas during their stay in a temporary relocation area after they were displaced by the magnitude 6.1 earthquake that struck Central Luzon on April 22, 2019. Another Indigenous group visited by the researcher together with colleagues was a Dumagat Remontadas community of Rizal that was affected by the flooding of the Tinipak River brought about by the typhoon Ulysses in November 2000 and by a tropical storm in January 2011. Now, these are my research questions. This research explored the challenges experienced by the displaced Aitas as they stay in a temporary relocation site and their resources or sources of strengths that may be tapped in developing community intervention measures during COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. Likewise, for the Dumagat Remontados, the study explored the challenges experienced by the mothers in the aftermath of 2 floodings in their area amid the COVID-19 pandemic. The community resources were also identified. Now for the study population were 2 Filipino indigenous people groups. First, the relocated Aitas in Porac, Pampanga in Central Luzon, Philippines. The Aitas ancestors were the Negritos, who were believed to be the first inhabitants of the Philippine Islands. Second, the Dumagat Remontados, who reside at the bank of Tinipak River in Leyte, Rizal, Philippines. The Dumagat Remontados ancestors were also Negritos who married those lowlanders who fled to the mountains to avoid Spanish subjugation. For the methodology, focus group discussions with 15 relocated Aita participants were conducted 7 months and 10 months after the disaster. Participation in the FGD was voluntary. An FGD guide was prepared by the author. Informed consent was obtained from the participants prior to data collection. Data analysis proceeded using thematic analysis. For the Dumagat Remontado communities, clinical interviews or consultations with 24 women were conducted a month after the last flooding of the Tinipak Riverside community. An interview guide was prepared by the author and colleagues. Informed consent was obtained from the respondents prior to data collection, and data analysis proceeded using thematic analysis. For the results of the study, Table 1 here shows the issues identified or the challenges experienced by the Aita and the Dumagat Remontados in their communities. Themes include the issues associated with the calamity and the issues associated with the pandemic. Those issues associated with the calamity include loss of lives, loss of livelihood, physical discomfort in the relocation area, fear of losing their ancestral domain, trauma, mental health problems experienced, loss of tradition, they cannot practice their traditional burial and healing practices, loss of access to food source and medicinal plants that resulted in illnesses and death among community members, and the high cost of living in the relocation area that resulted in children dropping out from school. On the other hand, issues associated with the pandemic included economic hardship due to lockdown, learning issues among children or disruption of school, with the parents having difficulty teaching their children at home, issues with childcare and discipline, with the children's disruptive behavior and excessive use of gadgets, and the shared fear of contracting COVID-19. Table 2 here shows the resources of the Aita and the Dumagat communities with the themes relational resources, cultural resources, and institutional support. With the relational resources, this include intergenerational source of support with the grandparents taking care of grandchildren, then the community support with neighbors helping each other, relatives offering their homes to kins who lost their houses due to flooding. There were also volunteers from surrounding communities. Cultural resources may include music and dance, spiritual practices, nature tripping, and the healing arts, also play, storytelling, and use of medicinal plants. For the institutional support, this may include the barangay and local government unit, schools, and non-government organizations that shared resources with the communities in times of calamity. Now for the key lessons learned from this study, it is important to take into consideration the cultural variables in the relocation of displaced Indigenous people community in the aftermath of disaster. Exacerbating their condition is their concern about securing their ancestral domain. They worry about land grabbing, and they are concerned about not being able to continue practicing their traditions, such as their healing arts and burial practices while they are in the relocation site. They also attribute the presence of illnesses and even deaths among tribe members to their lack of access to their source of natural food and medicinal plants while they are in the relocation area. Now, for children and adults who suffer from trauma, relational, cultural, and institutional resources may be tapped in the creation or development of a trauma care intervention program for the affected members of the community. For the Dumagat Remontado community, the hardship brought about by the calamities amid the pandemic only worsened their impoverished condition. Loss of loved ones, loss of livelihood, and mental health issues are some of the concerns that directly resulted from the calamity. The issues related to COVID-19, such as financial burden due to lockdown, problems related to distance learning, COVID-19 scare and childcare and discipline issues seem to worsen due to the calamity. Relational, cultural, and institutional resources may also be tapped in the development of trauma care intervention programs for the affected members of the community, such as making use of culture-based intervention, like application of their music and dance, healing arts, and nature tripping to address trauma among adults and children. This is somehow related to the bottom-up approach in trauma care intervention. In relocating an Indigenous community is a desired next step. In the aftermath of the disaster, local government units, the LGUs with Indigenous people, may create special guidelines that will factor in cultural variables. Among these are securing their ancestral domain, securing their access to food source and medicinal plants, which are crucial to their health and well-being. Cultural mapping with regards to wellness-related practices may also be conducted to identify and document the cultural healing practices in Indigenous communities. These healing practices may be examined and incorporated in mental health intervention programs in local government units for the Indigenous people survivors of disaster during COVID-19 pandemic and even beyond. To achieve these goals, the academe, community leaders, mental health workers, and local government units may have to work hand in hand so as to empower the Indigenous communities in the face of disasters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for helping to be able to play that. I was really hoping that Eden might be able to sign on here for the discussion period, because I'm really interested in the questions you raised. I've been doing some work on the way Buddhist communities have helped out with mental health concerns in other parts of the world, and I'd love to hear more about the kind of resources she was describing. So that may have to carry on at another time. But So once again, thanks to all the panelists. And I think what I'd like to do is first to open up to see if any of you have questions for each other or things you would like to elaborate on, and give a few minutes just for a little conversation among all of you, and then we'll open it up to questions. And just to remind all of our audience, you can either raise your hand for questions using the raise hand function, and then we'll call on you, or you can use the chat box to enter questions, and I can relay the questions to the panelists. Okay, so first, just if any of you have any comments about the other presentations or questions, or just comments on what you saw from the data relative to other things that you have been presenting on.
I'm happy to jump in, James. This is a question for Ara and her team. I'm wondering if some of the findings that you found relevant for the displaced communities from Tacloban are also relevant to some of the other disaster-affected communities across the Philippines, where there also may have been displacement, and whether they face some of the same challenges that the population that you studied did.
Yeah, I think I'll have to go first. Firstly, what makes Tacloban North resettlement sites unique and interesting is that it's because it is located on the outskirts of the city. But I do think that the key lessons that we found in our study is also similar to the experiences of disaster affected households in other resettlement sites, in the sense that during the pandemic, they might also have experienced how the pandemic exacerbated the issues on the lack of livelihood or even on water supply. So I do think that these lessons can also be it can also be used in other studies pertaining to other resettlement sites, because firstly, the pandemic really has impacted the livelihood security of all people, especially the resettlement site households. Also, it's very evident in the Philippines that there is a lack of effective public health campaigns pertaining to COVID-19 vaccines and even on COVID-19. So I do think that there should be like an effective public health campaign that will focus on ensuring that these vaccines are safe, they are reliable, they are credible, and these experiences are also very similar to a lot of people, especially those living in resettlement sites.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Maybe just one other thing that really seems apparent here is both in your research and in Eden's, as well as this sort of dynamic between disasters, exposure to natural hazards, and then the confluence of the pandemic at the same time. And it makes me think, particularly with the anticipated current, but also anticipated impacts of climate change, how these sort of cascading disasters will play out in the future, and how we can really prepare communities to cope with that, particularly as you're really referring to aspects of resilience being undermined by the sort of cascading of impact of these two things happening at the same time. So I wonder if you have any response to that, or anyone else who's with us on this webinar.
I think I can add to that. Hi, Enzo. That's really actually interesting, because that's very what I'm doing here at HKUST. That's the focus of my project, to look at the different survival, adaptation, as well as learning strategies these climate-displaced people are using, and the different factors that facilitate or hinder these different resources. For example, with regards to the question earlier on ARA, I think, Enzo, you mentioned that we have to provide context, right? So in terms of the likelihood that the impacts that we unraveled in Tacloban North, if these are also the same impacts that other people post-disaster or post-Haiyan communities are experiencing in other resettlement sites, I think that it is most likely, yes, because in the short term, immediate response of the Philippine government post-Haiyan, they implemented this no-build zone policy, right? So the different local government units decided that we have to move these people, informal settlers, untenured communities living in coastal zones, to move them far away from the coast. For example, in landlocked areas of the municipality or in town. That's why in Tacloban, they decided to move it in the north, wherein it's very far from the sea, and that it's far from the risk of storm surge, right? Also, that's the case in Palo, where they also relocated their coastal communities that were damaged by Haiyan to the, I think, east part of the municipality, going to a different, adjacent to to the next town because it's far from the coast. So I think when it comes to likelihood or similarity, they will also be they are also experiencing the same problems. With relation to compounding and cascading risks that they face there, I think that's really interesting, and I hope that in the future we also will be able to provide more empirical findings in terms of sharing to you guys here, maybe next year or 2 years after, once we gather our data.
Thank you for that, Jim. That's fantastic. And I noticed that Eden has joined us as well.
Yeah.
Now. I'll turn it
Mark has transformed into Aiden, and Aiden, we're so happy that you could join us, and thank you for actually being so organized to prepare a video just in case of a backup, and that worked wonderfully. So thank you. And we're just now just had started on kind of a question and answer period and a little bit of discussion. So we'll be very glad to have you as part of the conversation. So thanks for joining us. If it's okay, I'd love to follow up a little bit on Enzo's question, and just thinking, I think one of the things that impressed me about the presentations or that really that I learned from this is how localized everything really is. And I think this is a lesson we know from other places as well. Just, I mean, clearly some kind of national support and all of that is part of it, but really it's initiatives of people in communities and things like that. But leaving that aside for a minute, one of the things that I was thinking about is if, you know, I know that Enzo particularly works in other areas as well of the world, cross-culturally, not just in the Philippines. And I wondered if there were, if you were to have to say, what were some of the kind of what you might call unique challenges or unique opportunities that became apparent during this response to COVID in the Philippines. And I mean, clearly the piled on nature that was just referred to of having natural disasters then followed by a pandemic presented its own challenges. But I was thinking more just in terms of the nature of the response and all of that. So if anybody had any comments, I'd be really curious, just thinking a little bit broader in terms of what were the real issues that became apparent in the Philippines.
Yes, thank you so much, James, for that question about the opportunities that I was able to identify in my study is the relationship between families with regards to parent-child relationship. Even if there are challenges with regards to learning, because the burden of teaching the children are on the parents this time because of the modular mode of learning and online learning. But there are also opportunities in terms of teaching children life skills that couldn't easily be learned in school. Like, for example, when I interviewed mothers, they said they have difficulty teaching their children algebra, but their children now already know how to cook rice, something like that. And there are also opportunities in focusing on relationship within family members. Like before pandemic, people are busy, community members are busy with their work, but during lockdown they're confined inside their homes, and they can tell stories with each other and focus on improving their relationship within the family. So that's one of the opportunities that I have identified, or one of the you call advantages of being in a lockdown with your family members and even community members.
Great, thank you, Eden. I love the way you just jumped right into our discussion too, without missing a beat. So thank you, that's great. Any other comments?
Yeah, I have to add that one of the opportunities that we saw in our study is actually, like, for further studies, is actually to examine like plural drivers of knowledge on vulnerability to environmental and health hazards, because apparently there is the case of unequal vulnerability or unequal exposure to vulnerability and hazards. It is different across social groups. So I think it's an opportunity for further study that even if it's a local case study, it could cascade to or contribute to the global community as well if we try to understand or examine the drivers of vulnerability, maybe the structural causes or factors that drive vulnerability to environmental and also health hazards.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Ara. I mean, because one of the things I think that what your response actually raises is how this situation, and I would say it applies to much of the world too, is it served as a kind of a test in a sense, or an opportunity to look at varying ways of how civil society responded in countries, and also how governments responded, and it kind of gave an opportunity to view it in real time, and having, because I think of the speed of how things happen, it really revealed things in a way that not many other, I mean, I think a natural disaster obviously probably does very similar things, but this seemed to be, it was a disaster that played out, it was quick, but it played out over a very long period of time, which required, and it also involved everybody, not just a single location. I mean, it really did involve the entire globe and everybody in all cultures and societies, basically, it sure seemed. So anyway, it's an interesting, I was glad to hear you respond in that way, because it did provide a moment to kind of look at these different things. So, yeah.
If I may add, it's
Yes.
actually also interesting to look into the organic mushrooming of social movements that led to, or that resulted to, community-led response, at least in the different local places, right? For example, in the Philippines, there's this mushrooming of community pantries that, on one hand, it's good that there is the initiative of different people, local people, to give, because the tagline is give what you can and get what you need. Like give something or a product or anything, grocery, that you can, if you have a leftover or an excess, and just get something that you need for like one day. So it helps a lot of poor and marginalized communities or households to just access food sources that they need on a daily basis. So that's a good thing. But on the one hand, it also is, I think, a symptom of a failure of the government to provide this kind of resources, to their communities, especially in a time of crisis. So that's also one thing that is really interesting to look at.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you, Ginbert. And I think that one thing that's become clear, and it's probably something that was visible in the Philippines as well, is that it polarized, the responses in many ways kind of polarized, and we saw the best of people and the worst of people, I think, and that's continuing, unfortunately. I mean, I think one thing I noticed in all your presentations was mentioning just COVID misinformation, which is another form of a global pandemic that we have, and that transcends COVID-19. But anyway, I think your response was really interesting. So we have two questions, one in the chat and then one oral, and we'll turn to that one first. And I'm not sure if the pronunciation I'll get right. Is it Nika or?
Hi, it's Nika.
Nika, sorry about that. Anyway, thank you for joining us, and we'll turn the mic to you for your question.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm an alumnus of the University of the Philippines in Diliman. I'm doing my graduate studies here at Harvard for the year. And I'm doing my master's in education, and I'm really concerned with learning loss that occurred globally, but I think especially in places like Tacloban, where I don't know the situation, what the access to the internet is now, and what that meant for the continuation of learning in this time. And also, I have tried to obtain information on whether alternative modes of learning have continued in the pandemic. I was involved with the alternative learning system for a while. I was trying to get some word on how they're doing and didn't hear anything. So I'm wondering if any of you know about that. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Nika. It's nice to meet you. In the case of the Philippines, like when we were doing our data gathering in the resettlement sites, internet connection in the resettlement sites is very unstable. So it was hindering the um, learning of the students. So what we observed in the resettlement sites is they did away with the online classes. So how they do it in like Google Classroom or in any other platforms, what they do is they are asking for modules from their teachers and submitting those modules in a particular venue. So the parents or the guardians are the ones submitting the modules to the teachers at a designated venue instead of the students. So because of internet instability, this was the alternative form of learning that the students were doing. So online classes in Google Classroom or let's say in Zoom was not feasible. So they do it by modules.
Yes, Nika, if I may add, learning during pandemic has become a family affair because every member of the family has to contribute to answering the module. Sometimes it's the mothers who would answer the module so that they can submit this to the teacher. So it was like that. And it was very sad that for some of the mothers, especially in the marginalized communities, they have poor educational attainment and they could not help their children with their lessons. Like, for example, they haven't even finished elementary and they can't do the math. So they have difficulty teaching their children. So it has become an added burden to them on top of other concerns.
If it's okay, I wouldn't mind pushing Nika's really excellent question just one step further too, just to ask on the side. I mean, I appreciate definitely. I mean, I had two high schoolers home during this as well, and it was unbelievable in terms of, well, I mean, it was really nice in some ways. I spent more time with my daughters than I had, you know, in the previous 2 years for sure. But it also was more just kind of sad to view the world through their eyes of what they were forced to be coping with. But I also think that we should also keep in mind here the impact on the teachers. And at least I don't know in the Philippines what that situation necessarily was like. But one of the things that I've been particularly impressed with here is, and actually, well, impressed, but also dismayed by, is the situations that teachers were put into. So I don't know how teachers coped in the situation in the Philippines per the education during COVID. So just throw that one out as the other side of the equation.
I think Ara and Eden can really answer that.
Yes.
Working in a state university in Leyte, the pandemic actually added more paperwork for the teachers. So aside from handling online classes, we also have to prepare more paperwork than necessary than compared to what we did before the pandemic. So I think that's also an added burden. And also we have to face the fact that not all students can attend online classes. Even with college students, not all students can attend to online classes. And therefore we have to cater to the students outside of the online classes. So we have consultation hours, but at the same time, we have to entertain also the students outside of our consultation hours because firstly, problems with internet instability. And students during the pandemic, I have had students who were working part-time also because their parents, for example, have lost their jobs due to employee layoffs or whatsoever. So these were the examples during the pandemic while I was working in the university. So I think also Professor Eden can also share her experiences.
Yes. At the start of the pandemic, we moved to online learning with my students. I needed to upgrade my skill in the use of technology how to keep up with my tech-savvy students. So we attended webinars and all that. We prepared course packs for our students, and we have to consider those who don't have internet connection and those who cannot attend online classes. So we kind of have to adjust your curriculum. You have to adjust your syllabi for those students, and you have to be really patient because you deal with students who are also having a lot of problems in their homes aside from the demand of school. So you have to apply a lot of compassion, a lot of consideration, and while also taking care of your own household. Yeah, that's a scenario for teachers.
Yeah. I think particularly what Ara mentioned about paperwork, I think Enzo could attest to the fact that for us as well, this was a huge uptick. But I think the overall point, again, just thinking of kind of lessons and what might be, sorry, I think I'm hearing some feedback. If everybody could just mute. There we go. Okay, thanks very much. Sorry, there was a little bit of sound coming in. But again, thinking about long-term lessons to be learned here and perhaps future applicability of what we've learned through this may be a kind of a silver lining, perhaps. Hopefully we won't be in the same situations again, but I could see it certainly crossing over into other domains of other types of issues that may arise. Something I think one thing that we're pretty confident is that whether we have an uptick again in COVID, in spite of that, there's going to be other challenges to the systems that are going to be inevitable, and preparation and advanced planning are going to be key. Let me take one of the questions from in the chat here, and this was something I was thinking about as well, is just the linguistic diversity of the Philippines and how you were able to surmount the problems. I know in listening to Eden's and also Ara's presentation in particular, but I think probably at the backside of Enzo's as well, is that you're dealing with just a tremendous amount of local languages and dialects and things like that. So how did you, I imagine even for residents in the Philippines, that this is a challenge when you go to other parts of the Philippines, ability to communicate and carry out your research. So how did you surmount those challenges?
I'm happy to dive in on this one. Sorry, Eden, if it's okay, I'll just mention what we did with the nationwide survey that we conducted. First of all, it took us nearly a year and a half to create the survey instrument itself, because we really tried to work locally in order to make sure that we were asking the right questions fundamentally in the first place. And then when it came to actually testing the survey instrument and getting it prepared to be able to collect data, we had it translated and back translated in the five major Filipino languages. Of course, there are many more than those five, but the vast majority of people that we would have come across based on the sort of random sampling that we were doing would have had access to one of those five languages. So that's how we handled that. But I think at a much more local level, this really becomes a serious issue, and it sort of melds. It's not only language, but it's also customs, religion, and other beliefs, traditional beliefs as well. But that was my experience, and I think Eden also wanted to say something.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. It was lagging here.
Oh, it was just about how to overcome the tremendous array of dialects in different languages spoken, and how to carry out research in such a linguistically diverse context. And I imagine that presents problems actually for delivery of services in some cases, possibly.
Well, it's really an advantage if you speak the local language. Like, for example, in working with Indigenous people, it's really it's advantageous if you know to speak the Aita language, for example, or the Dumagat language. But this Dumagat and Aita people also know how to speak Tagalog, Filipino. So that's the language that we used. But it would have been good, and I could have gathered richer data if I know their language. which unfortunately I don't. But I have gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are very important in translating some important information from the community. And yeah, so they were a lot of help to me when I gathered my data, the local gatekeepers.
Great, thanks, Eden. We also have a question in the chat by Sally Mae Abalanes. I see you're signed in. I don't know if you want to ask it orally or you would like me to take care of it. I can certainly do that if that's more convenient. I'll give you a second if you want to just unmute. You can ask your question, but
yeah, I can ask the question. So it's more of, because I'm actually from the health sector in the Philippines, and I'm also in a lot in disaster medicine and disaster management. So it's more of like because we know that the perception of the Filipinos, actually, they think that the local it's really decentralized, that it's a local government unit who will be in charge of disaster preparedness. But then in terms of health services, and during the pandemic where all the policies were coming from the central government, were you able to see that there were changes in the perceptions stemming from the pandemic? And then were there also different changes in terms of how health was accessed by the marginalized communities during the pandemic? And also, if they, like, is there's really just inequity, and how did they perceive that? Like, were they gonna go directly to like, did they perceive that they will get better help or better health from a private facility or versus a government facility?
great. Thank you, Sally Mae. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Okay. Yes, please go
Joy.
ahead.
Okay, sorry. In my perspective, I think that's one of the things that we need to change. The perspective that the change should always come from above. Like, it's a top-down way of helping from above, cascading down to the grassroots. But one way of empowering communities is making them realize the resources they have, which they can use, which they can actually discover. Like, for example, the healing practices. Usually when there's disaster, psychosocial support workers from the government would go to this groups, marginalized communities, without realizing that these communities themselves have their own resources that they can actually use in helping themselves. So as we try to, change this a bit by helping these communities realize their resources and probably guiding them on how to harness what they already have in order to help themselves, I think that's a big contribution that we can give to the community.
Yes. Hi, Sally Mae. Thank you for the question. We've actually asked the respondents in our study whether the health services were accessible in their area. Most of them actually responded that it's accessible. However, they chose to self-medicate, for example, in the cases that they have cough or colds, because of the cumbersome and exhaustive requirements that is needed in both government and private hospitals. So they did not distinguish between the requirements of the government and the private hospitals, but what they emphasized during the data gathering was that it was harder during the pandemic to access health services or to go to hospitals because of cumbersome and exhaustive requirements, and they have this perception that if they go to the hospitals at the peak of the pandemic, they'll be labeled as COVID-19 positive. So these were the perceptions around our respondents during the time of data gathering, where it was still at the peak of the pandemic.
Fascinating. Let's see. I have a question for all of you, actually, and particularly for our panelists that are in the Philippines right now, too. I think one of the big topics of the speaker series thus far, naturally, is that this is happening in the lead up to the May 9th elections that are on the horizon, coming up very quickly. And I was just curious, I know that the political landscape is changing pretty quickly in terms of those candidates and shifting, and perhaps it's even difficult to get good information, but I was just curious about this issue of the COVID-19 pandemic and whether that has become part of any of the political platforms. Is it an issue that people are worried about in terms of thinking about electing the next leader of the Philippines? And how much is it part of public discourse now, just as a topic? I mean, it was a huge part of the U.S. election, for example. Any? Maybe none. I know that there's a lot of things going on social media and things, but yeah.
Thank you, James. Actually, I don't hear much about COVID-19 anymore as part of the programs of this candidates. It's more about personality and some history, etc.
Yeah.
James, I cannot really answer related to how COVID is used as a political platform in terms of campaigning for our local candidates. But I'm actively following local news in our region, at least in our city, and that I've observed that based on our local news is that there seems to be an increase of granting the official award of the resettlement houses to the beneficiaries. So this intensified because the context in the local is that not all of or many resettlement houses are not yet occupied, and some of them, although they are occupied, the official certificate of land tenure entitlement of the household is not yet given. But since late last year, there have been instances wherein national senators come to our locality and go to these resettlement sites and distribute this certificate.
Yeah, I wonder, more perhaps generalize this slightly and maybe direct this to Enzo too is, I think what I'm perceiving, I would actually say that there's some of the same sentiments in the US even of a kind of COVID fatigue and people wanting just to forget about it all and just move on and all of this. And I would imagine that for people interested in public health and preparedness and all of that, there's a danger in this, is that how can one carry on appropriate planning if people are not wanting to, really deal with the reality that there's going to be something else, or that this is still an issue even. And I think we're starting to hear rumblings even in the US of other variants and we have no idea what's going to happen yet. And so silence, and it sounds like that's what is resounding, is a kind of silence on this, maybe present itself as another kind of a problem, as much as we all psychologically perhaps want to just move on and get back to something we call normal.
I think that's exactly right, James. I'm happy to jump in on this one. I think what our experience with COVID and COVID's happening both following other natural hazards and disasters, and then other hazards happening while we're experiencing COVID, really shows and it underlines some of the things that we discussed earlier, where you really see some of the fractures, the weaknesses across states and within states, across different areas within states in its ability to organize, prepare, respond efficiently. And also this fatigue that you're talking about. I think these are all really important things to be thinking about, because if we think 2 years of the pandemic is an issue, we're going to be dealing with decades, if not more, of climate change impacts that are also equally going to affect the entire world in different ways, very different, depending again on the local context, but still profoundly something that's going to impact the entire world. and that will, if left to hoping for better times, really undermine resilience. And so we have to be thinking seriously about what lessons we can take from the fact that we're experiencing the pandemic and other things happening at the same time, what this means for what we're going to be able to do as societies and as a global society to address the challenges that climate change is starting to bring and will be bringing for a long time to come.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just make one pitch that utilization of empirical evidence, using science, getting data, and turning that data into actionable work that informs policies, training, and empowers local leaders who really understand their context and can apply those lessons the most effectively is something that is probably a universal lesson out of this experience here.
Yeah, even if that goes on kind of at an invisible behind the scenes level, I mean, social media can do whatever it wants. But when it comes down to dealing with the raw facts of reality, that's the only thing that's going to work.
I think that's also a grand challenge for people in the academe as well as for policymakers to, improve science communication, that our empirical data is understandable and, that local people appreciate it. Because specifically in the Philippines, I think we are a country of fake news. Fake news is really rampant in the Philippines, and sadly, because of the low speed of internet connection as well as high cost, people really tend to access social media that is, free. For example, Facebook, and sadly, this has become the one major source of information of local people, either it be fake or it be true.
Great, thanks, Ginbert. We have a few minutes left, and if I could be so selfish to ask Eden a question of something that I'm generally interested in other areas, I was struck by the kind of close work that you were doing with these Indigenous communities, and particularly, and also it's come across in your oral comments to some of the questions, and I appreciate very much the kind of respect and listening and trying to work with those communities. What the question I had was the resources that were drawn on by Indigenous kind of spiritual communities to deal with mental health responses or issues that came up as part of this. I mean, and maybe if you could put that in context to say professional services and things like that, or how people were drawing from two different domains there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much for that, James. Yes, as much as we respect Indigenous communities and we respect their culture, it's also for us to be critical about the probably parts of the culture that may not serve the individuals in a just manner, or some, human rights violations, for example, within the Indigenous communities, because there are also some irregularities within the culture that may cross some human rights principles, and we also have to be critical about that. In terms of some practices, like for example, the spiritual practices that some individuals may have within the communities that may actually be helpful for community members, but at the same time, yes, that's our role in science, that we have to make sure that these are truly helpful. That's why when science comes, for example, in studying culture, we need to really know that these kinds of practices, when applied, are science-based. These are results-based, and this actually works. That's why it's important for the academe, the Indigenous leaders, and some local government sectors to collaborate to come up with evidence-based approach in helping communities.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I definitely see the importance of having evidence-based, responses and ways of putting that into action. But I also think there's some things which are hard to quantify and to actually scientize cultural practices that may have a very strong use value, but may not be possible to get empirical scientific data about them. And I'm personally, I teach at a university, and facts and data are essential to what we do. But I also see the use value of certain things that can be functionally effective in spite of what we might think about them from a scientific level. Anyway, that's my own personal kind of feeling about that. At least seeing it as in practice elsewhere. Yeah.
I'll just give you an example. Like, for example, stomach ache. A stomach ache may be caused by a lot of things. Like, it could be caused by spirits, some physiological factors, and when you're in an Indigenous community, because of their difficulty in enriching professionals, healthcare professionals, they would bring this sick person to a local healer, and the local healer may diagnose it differently, and it could be a case of rupturing appendicitis. Yeah. So sometimes it's really difficult, to just rely on the Indigenous knowledge, and there should be a cross between the Indigenous knowledge and also some evidence-based ways of healing that we know of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ginbert?
I think I would actually agree to what you said, James. I think that we have to also take a pause and, as academicians, we have to recognize that there are plural sources and many diverse sources of knowledge as well as practices. And these may not be clinically effective, as what Eden said, but these things matter, as well as these things are important to local Indigenous people, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it should start with the recognition that we shouldn't privilege one source of knowledge over the other. These things should be complementary when applied and when interrogated.
Hmm. Yeah, I was more referring to more on the kind of the mental health side of things. But even there, I think most people would realize that there are certain pathologies that do require, modern Western scientific interventions, and there's no doubt about that. There's just certain things that you're not going to have a response for, but there may be ways of integrating more Indigenous things as part of a longer term kind of lifestyle issues and things like that, which are productive. And I would also say that this is, to get back to Enzo's point about potential impacts of climate change and all of this, is that I would suspect that there would be some opportunities for thinking with Indigenous communities in terms of either traditional forms of knowledge or going back to earlier value systems that might be applicable as we think to the future, rather than thinking we can only, scientize our way out of the issues that we're facing. And I'm in places that I've done work as well. I think there can also be a tendency to be less receptive to sort of science or Western science coming in as kind of a cure-all and all of that. And I'm sure Enzo's is very sensitive to these types of things as well, and with the general perspective of working with people and combining knowledges. But I don't know if that resonates with you, Enzo, or not. But yeah,
it absolutely does resonate, and I think it goes back to something Eden, that you said earlier about people being self-reliant, realizing that they have a lot of coping capacities and abilities themselves. But there's a balance. There's a balance between these things, because you don't want that to be an excuse either for government not fulfilling its responsibilities.
That's true.
So there's, and this is the same thing here between respecting cultural norms and values that are local, but looking for ways to adapt them to what we're learning from the science, so that it comes from mutual respect, it comes from mutual understanding. And I think there's a balance that can be struck between the two. Doing one to the exclusion of the other is invariably going to lead to problems and a suboptimal outcome. And so there has to be this kind of balance.
Yeah.
Yes.
and the
If
danger.
I may,
Yeah,
sorry,
please go ahead,
James.
Edith. No, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may add, with regards to mental health, because you mentioned that's your interest, James. There are cultural practices, like for example, in dance, music, the arts, which is related to the bottom-up approach in trauma care, and that bottom-up approach as opposed to the top-down approach, like you have to process everything, you have to think in order to deal with trauma. But for the bottom-up approach, it's different. You have to deal with the senses first. It's like you have to work with the lower brain first, before you bring up the issue of trauma to the higher cognitive processes. So this is the area of study that I'm actually interested in getting into, in exploring how these cultural practices are related to this bottom-up approach of dealing with trauma or managing trauma among individuals with traumatic-related disorders.
Sure. Great. Wonderful. I'd love to hear more about it at some point, Eden, too. I think this is, again, one of the sort of long-term, the slow crisis, if one can put it that way, the long-term crisis that's coming out of this. And I imagine it's global, but I can only say from what we see around us here in the US is the psychological and mental impacts of this have just been much worse than anybody really anticipated, to be honest. I mean, I think people had a growing sense of what the real physical and health-related impacts of COVID would be. But I think it took people a while to realize what the mental, particularly on younger population, I think, and elder population as well, too. I mean, it's anyway, I think it'll be one of those long-term issues that Enzo was kind of talking about as well, both for climate change and as well. So, well, any other comments by anybody? I think we have kept our panelists here for a while, and appreciated really all of your insights. If there was any last word of anybody, we could take that. Otherwise, great. Well, then I would love to just have a big thank you to all of you for participating and sharing your knowledge and also this really wonderful research that you produced. I hope that we'll see more of it. I think it's really important. And I personally am thankful. I don't work in this area, but I love the opportunity to learn what's happening on the ground. And this was a really great opportunity. If you don't mind, I'll make a plug for the next talk in the series here. The next three actually we have coming up for those who are interested. Next week on April 13th will be a presentation by my former colleague at the University of Michigan, Deirdre Dela Cruz. And we're going to be shifting the topic away from elections and other things into an interesting area of her research. And the title of her presentation is From Ghosts to Guts, the Politics of the Paranormal in the 20th Century Philippines. And she works really interesting work on spirit photography and all kinds of cool things that are going on. So, and then the following lecture will be on April 27th at 4 p.m. By Sheila Coronel, who was a former dean of journalism at Columbia University, and she'll be speaking directly on the May 2022 elections in the Philippines. And the subtitle is Dysfunctional Democracy and the Authoritarian Temptation. So that should be interesting. That'll be basically coming more or less a week or so before the election. So it'll be kind of the last on that. And then on May 20th, we'll be joined by the recent Nobel laureate Maria Ressa, who will be presenting a talk as the culmination of this series and also the 2022 Tsai lecture for the Asia Center. So please join us if you can. Really appreciate everybody signing in who joined us. And thank you all again to the panelists for sharing information, and have a wonderful day and a good sleep, Enzo.
Thank you. Thanks all. Thanks, James.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.